So fair warning, I've included a video with today's number 2 story, and if you have a fear of deep, dark water or are claustrophobic, you may want to consider skipping it. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right channel because that's all we do, and we upload 3, 4, even 5 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please tell the like button you're sorry for all the hostility this year and that you want to take them on vacation as a way of making up for it. When they say yes, bring them to Skinwalker Ranch and promptly punt them through the portal. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's stories. In October of 2007, Helena Carroll and her fiance, John Cullen, had saved a little bit of money and they were torn on what to do with it. They knew they should put it aside and put it towards a down payment on a new house, but they also really wanted to go on vacation, and lately life had been very stressful for both of them, and so ultimately they decided, let's just blow it all on an amazing vacation. And so later that month, they flew off to Thailand. Over the course of their week, they spent most of their time at their resort, sitting in the pool and eating nice food, and they were having this really nice time. And on their last day, they decided they needed to do something a little bit more adventurous. And so they decided to explore the Nam Talu cave inside of the Khao Sok National Park, which is this 160 million year old rainforest that was not that close to their resort. In fact, it was not really a huge tourist destination because of how cumbersome it was to get there. But from everything they read about this park and specifically this cave they wanted to go in, it was just this breathtaking experience, and so they were sold. After signing up for a guided tour, they headed down to the pier where they boarded a boat and drove 90 minutes to the entrance of this park. When they got off, they met their 2 guides and then walked down to this entrance area where they connected with the other 5 tourists that were going to be on this tour with them. Those 5 people were 2 Swiss parents and their 2 teenage daughters, along with a 10-year-old German boy who was there on his own. After everyone had said hello and introduced themselves, they began walking through the park towards this cave. The allure of the Nam Talu cave, which is the cave they were going to be going to, was there was a river that ran through it where at times as you walked through this cave, you'd have to hold onto a rope and wade through the water where the water was up to your waist or even up to your neck at times. But it felt safe and controlled, and it was kind of exhilarating for foreign tourists to go through the cave. As they were just about to get to the entrance of the Nam Talu cave, some park rangers happened to walk down the path next to them, and they exchanged some words with the 2 local guides that were leading this tour, and they told them it's a bad idea to go into the Nam Talu cave because this is the monsoon season. No one's supposed to be in there, and if it starts raining while you're inside the cave, you won't hear it, and it will flood the cave, and then you'll be trapped. But despite the warning, the group continued on because it hadn't rained that day, and there wasn't any rain in the forecast, and the 2 local guides that were leading this tour were really confident that they were not in danger. They entered the cave a little after 1 p.m. and right away they were walking through little puddles of water that got a little bit deeper, and pretty soon they were holding onto the rope and walking through the deeper sections of the cave. Water's up to their waist, and by all accounts it was very exciting. And the entirety of the tour should only take about an hour, where it's 30 minutes in, you hit the turnaround point and you come back. And they had made it about 20 to 25 minutes in, right before the turnaround point, when Helena and John, who were towards the front of the tour group, heard what sounded like a rushing or roaring sound coming from the entrance of the cave. And they turned around and they saw this wave of water barreling into the cave. And instinctively, John and Helena start climbing up the walls. And luckily there was a ledge where they were, and they managed to scramble up onto this ledge. And Helena would say as soon as she got up there, she turned around to look where she had just been standing, right as this surge of water blasted past them, carrying with it the 2 tour guides and the 10-year-old German boy, who immediately got swept around the corner down the dark tunnel. And then seconds later, the 2 Swiss parents and their teenage daughters, they got swept away around the corner. The couple was now stranded on this ledge with no time to be upset about what they're witnessing, because the water was not only surging past them, it was rising, and there was limited amount of space before they would just be completely submerged in water. And so they tried their best to climb up this wall to a slightly higher ledge, which was still only a few feet away from these rushing rapids. And so as they're crouched up on this ledge, John eventually says to Helena, we're gonna die if we stay here, we're gonna drown. And so I need to find a way to maybe get past this initial rush of water, and maybe on the far side of the cave, I can work my way back up to the entrance and hopefully get us some help. And initially Helena said, don't do it, don't leave, we're safe here. But eventually he said to her, I have to go. I love you. I have to go." And she said, "Okay." And he jumped into the water, and almost immediately he was pulled under and disappeared. For the next 20 hours, Helena had to sit on this ledge in total darkness until the water finally began to subside a little bit and rescuers could come in to get her. What had happened was, after Helena and the rest of the tour group had gone inside of the cave, they made it just far enough in that they were out of earshot of what was happening outside of the cave. Right at that moment, a huge freak storm rolled in. There was this flash flood that was so intense, the lake that was right outside of the entrance to this cave, it rose up and began dumping directly into the cave. It was like a dam basically breaking, and all the water just poured in all at once. When Helena was finally let out of the cave, she didn't know what happened to her fiance or the other tourists that were part of the group. But as soon as she stepped outside, she saw there were 8 coffins that had been lined up right outside, and she found out that she was the sole survivor. Despite this tragedy, people still go into the Nam Talu cave even during monsoon season. In 2014, 35-year-old Darren Spivey was a passionate scuba diver, and he wanted to share that passion with his 15-year-old son, Dylan. So on Christmas Eve that year, he gave his son an early gift, scuba tanks. The pair was apparently so excited to use them that they planned on doing an early morning dive the very next day on Christmas. Later, Dylan's grandmother would tell the media that her grandson actually didn't really want to go on this dive trip, but he knew his dad did, and he adored his father and didn't want to let him down, so he decided to go anyways. The following morning, the father and son got up and they made their way to a local dive site, only to discover that the gate to the dive site was locked. The father still really wanted to do this dive, and so he decided he would take them to another dive site in Central Florida, which was inside of a wildlife management area that he knew was open 24/7 to hunters and hikers and divers. So the pair drove over to the entrance of this park, and sure enough, it was open. And so they went through and began driving down these windy back roads until they finally reached this dirt lot that was right next to a pond. They got out of the car, they put on their wetsuits and their scuba gear, and began waddling their way over to this wooden walkway that starts in the parking lot and goes all the way up and out onto the pond like a dock. And as they walked down this wooden walkway, they would have passed a number of signs telling them, do not dive in this pond unless you're an expert diver. Because this is not just some pond. This pond was the entrance to the infamous and deadly Eagle's Nest, which in the cave diving community is known as the Mount Everest of cave diving. At the bottom of this little placid-seeming pond is a narrow hole that is a tunnel that goes straight down, and that is the single way in or out of this massive underwater cave system. Expert divers will swim over to this hole and grab the guideline that goes down into this cave, and they'll follow it and they'll swim straight down until the light above them fades, and all they can see below them is just black nothingness. And once they get through the end of this tunnel, it opens up into this massive chasm that's called the ballroom. And as soon as you get into the ballroom, if you stop and shine your light in any direction, you will not see a wall. No matter how powerful your flashlight is, you can't see a wall. It's so big. Divers that have been down there have said it feels like you're in outer space. This guideline goes straight down to the bottom of the ballroom at about 130 feet, at which point you see a sign that has a Grim Reaper on it that says, "Stop, prevent your own death, do not go any farther. There's nothing in this cave that is worth dying for." Basically, this is your last chance to turn around and get to the surface relatively easily, because from this sign, the cave splits off in 2 different directions, where the tunnel gets narrower and it kind of spiders around, and in certain points it goes all the way down to 300 feet. So beyond this sign, it is extremely dangerous unless you know what you're doing. And even then, it's still extremely dangerous. There's also a current that runs through Eagle's Nest. So if you were to lose the guideline, especially in the ballroom, you could be blown away and then have a really hard time finding it again because it's pitch black down there and it's like finding a needle in a haystack. And if you're not holding on to the guideline, it's nearly impossible to find the one way out. So you understand how intimidating and dark and dangerous this place is. Here's a video of a diver going through that tunnel into the ballroom.
Down there, there's a warning sign or a stop sign, warning divers that aren't trained for this type of diving, cave trained or trimix trained, to not go any further, to help save lives. A lot of divers have died trying to do these types of dives, and the thing is, at these depths, small mistakes can cost lives. So the sign is there just as a warning to help prevent any future accidents.
But as Darren and Dylan sat at the end of the walkway getting ready to jump into this pond, they were unfazed by the countless warnings, even though neither of them were expert divers. In fact, Dylan wasn't even a certified diver at all. This was one of his first dives. Before the pair jumped into the water, Darren texted his fiancée and said they were at Eagle's Nest and they were about to do this dive and that he would call when they got back to the surface. After that, he put his phone away on the surface and the two of them jumped into the water and started swimming their way over to the entrance to Eagle's Nest. Hours went by and Darren's fiancée did not get a call from Darren. And so by the time the sun was going down, she decided she had to go check on them. So she hopped in the car and she drove to the parking lot at Eagle's Nest and she saw Darren's car and no sign of the boys anywhere. Police were called and very quickly professional divers were brought to Eagle's Nest to go down and see if they were still down there. The divers got in the water, they made their way over to the narrow entrance, they went down the tunnel, they entered into the ballroom, and they stopped, holding onto the guideline. They pulled out their flashlights and began scanning around the ceiling immediately inside of the ballroom, because they had done this before, and it was not uncommon to have fatalities inside of caves be near the entrance. And as they're scanning around, they stop when they see Dylan's lifeless body trapped up against the ceiling about 6 feet away from the entrance. He had inflated his water wings, which are emergency flotation devices. His mouthpiece was out of his mouth, and it would turn out he had no more air left in his tanks. After the divers retrieved Dylan's body, they went back into Eagle's Nest, and they went all the way down following the guideline to the bottom of the ballroom where they found Darren. He was laying on a little sandy hill, his mouthpiece was out, he also had no air left in his tanks, and he was laying right next to the famous sign that has the Grim Reaper on it that says, "Stop, prevent your own death, don't go any farther." Both Darren and Dylan's gauges showed they had gone down to 230 feet. For reference, between 0 and 130 feet is considered recreational diving. And so in those depths, you can breathe regular air. So the same air you breathe on the surface is the air that goes in your tanks. You don't need really special training. You can kind of do whatever you want in those depths. Below 130 feet, you need to breathe a special gas mix, you need special equipment, and you definitely need specialized training. All three of those things Dylan and Darren did not have. After an investigation was done into their deaths, it was determined it was an accident, and the going theory was they went through the entrance into the ballroom, they went all the way down, and then they went into one of the two tunnels that spiders off to the side, and they managed to go all the way down to 230 feet. And at that depth, they must have developed a nasty case of nitrogen narcosis, which is like being drunk. And so in that state, they must have lost track of time and how much air they were using. And so by the time they got back to the ballroom to begin their ascent, they ran out of air. The son must have run out first and grabbed his father, shown him his air gauge to point out that he has no air left. His dad, in seeing that, must have taken his regulator out and put it in his son's mouth, and they began buddy breathing as they ascended to the exit. Except the father's tanks also ran out of air very shortly after that, and the father passed out and sank to the bottom. The son managed to get a full breath of air and began trying to swim as fast as he could to the surface. He even inflated his water wings to make himself go faster. Except in his panic, he must have let go of the guideline and swam all the way up and then hit the ceiling and then been not able to find the way out and ultimately drowned. Today, despite all the warnings outside and inside of the cave itself telling inexperienced divers to not go any farther, inexperienced divers continue to go into Eagle's Nest, and inexperienced divers continue to die inside of Eagle's Nest. To date, 11 people have died inside of that cave. Midday on June 10th, 1981, an Italian man and his 6-year-old son walked to the edge of their property in Frascati, which is an area in Italy known as the hub of Rome's local wine industry. The father needed to repair a section of their fence, and his son, who he said had the soul of Huckleberry Finn, wanted to tag along. But as soon as the work began, Alfredo just wanted to go play in the vineyards, and so he ran off. And the father didn't think much of it because his son always played in the vineyards and just figured he would see him back at the house. When the father finished up the work around 7 p.m. and walked back into his house, he was surprised that Alfredo wasn't there. And so he asked his wife, have you seen our son? And she said, no, can you go out and find him because dinner's going to be on the table any minute. So the father goes back outside expecting to see Alfredo come running out from behind some hiding place, but he doesn't. And he yells out for his son and doesn't get a response. And so he begins walking his property and yelling for Alfredo. and he's not finding him. And so after 2 hours of looking, he finally just calls the police. The police arrive, and initially it's just a couple of officers with flashlights, and they spend about 2 hours looking as well. They can't find him, so they call in backup in the form of officers with sniffer dogs, and the dogs began searching the property for another 3 hours, and they still couldn't find him. A little after midnight, the fire department, known in Italy as the fire brigade, they joined in as well. Shortly thereafter, a fire brigade officer was on the edge of Alfredo's property when he discovered a small hole in the ground. It would turn out Alfredo's neighbor had dug an illegal well, which was a common practice at the time, and generally, if you dug one of these wells and you struck water, you would report the well. But if you dug down and you didn't find water, you would just cover it up with a girder and you wouldn't tell anyone. In this case, however, the hole the officer was looking at did not have anything covering it. And so he knelt down and he yelled Alfredo's name into this hole, and at first he didn't hear anything. Then he yelled again, and he heard Alfredo yell back for his mother. Alfredo must not have seen the opening as he was running around playing, and he fell feet first into an 80-meter deep shaft. After Alfredo was found, the fire brigade took over rescue efforts, and so additional fire brigade units were called to help. But as soon as those additional units showed up, the captains of the different units began arguing with each other because it wasn't really clear how they were going to get him out. And unfortunately, the fire brigade immediately made a very bad decision. They decided to lower a plank into the shaft attached by a rope that he could grab onto, and they could pull him out that way. But when they lowered it at about 24 meters, the plank got stuck inside of the tunnel. And when they yanked on the rope to try to free it, the rope came off of the plank, but the plank remained wedged in the tunnel, blocking the tunnel. By the following morning, TV crews had swarmed the area, and one of them offered up a two-way microphone that could be lowered down into the hole so they could talk directly to Alfredo. When the microphone was finally lowered down next to his face, he was crying and pleading for them to get him out and that he missed his mother. Amateur spelunker Tullio Barnaby, a 23-year-old, had come over and joined the vigil that night. The plank plan shocked him for its foolishness, and so too did the scene. It was like everyone and no one was in charge. The well opening had been widened in hopes that a very skinny person would be willing to be lowered down to remove the piece of wood that was obstructing the tunnel. And since Tullio was a spelunker and was comfortable in confined spaces and was pretty skinny, he volunteered himself to do it. As he was lowered down, he quickly realized the inside of this tunnel was not a straight shot. It was more like a corkscrew. And so because of its windy nature, he was not able to get down to the wood. And so he signaled to go back up again. And when he reached the surface, he didn't have the wood in hand, but he told the fire brigade that because of the windy nature, it's unlikely Alfredo fell all the way to the bottom. He's probably stuck somewhere in the middle, which is a good thing. But we have to be really careful as we pull him out that we don't do anything that unintentionally causes him to slip farther into the hole. Tullio's suggestion was they go out and recruit professional spelunkers to be involved in the rescue because they would understand how to get someone out of such a tight space so far down in the ground. But the fire brigade disregarded his advice and said, we don't have enough time for that. At 6 a.m. the next day, about 12 hours after Alfredo's fallen into the swell, the fire brigade would make another very poor decision. They decided they would drill down another hole parallel to the one Alfredo was in, and they would drill down past the point they believed Alfredo was, at which point they would turn and drill laterally and connect to the tunnel Alfredo's in, grabbing Alfredo, pulling him across, and back up the new tunnel. Tullio objected, and he said the vibrations from this drill are almost certainly going to dislodge the boy and cause him to slip farther into the tunnel. But once again, the fire brigade did not listen to him. The drilling began about 2 hours later, and by that afternoon, Alfredo's plight had become major national news, with every single TV station playing a 24/7 live broadcast of the well, watching the drilling take place. Even the Italian president made a special trip to the well to see how it was going. But the drilling was very slow, and Alfredo, he had that microphone next to his head, and he was crying half the time, and the other times he was just pleading with them to get him out and saying he was cold or that he was tired, and the rescuers would say, we're going to be down there to get you, don't fall asleep, we're going to get you out of there. Finally, after 36 hours, they had drilled all the way down to their intended stopping point, and they began drilling across into Alfredo's well. When they finally broke into Alfredo's well, rescuers rushed in with flashlights and looked up and looked down, and there was no sign of Alfredo. And they called it up to the top, and they said, he's not here. and then all of a sudden they heard a faint voice coming from all the way down at the bottom of the well. The vibrations from all of the drilling had indeed caused Alfredo to slip all the way to the very bottom. They estimated he was approximately 30 meters below this new parallel tunnel, and at that depth, the temperatures would be freezing. And so now Alfredo, on top of everything else, was facing hypothermia. They quickly lowered the microphone again down to Alfredo, and they told him, "We're going to get you out of there. We're sorry we dropped you, but we're going to get you." And Alfredo's voice came back weak. He was tired, he was sore, he was freezing, he was crying. It was like the situation was just getting so much worse by the second, and rescuers knew they had to get to him probably in the next couple of hours, or that was it. And so another skinny man volunteered to go down into the hole, and they lowered him, and he would go all the way down to the bottom where Alfredo was. And he would call up that he found him and that Alfredo was alive. But Alfredo was stuck waist deep in this mud that the guy could not pull him out of. And so every time he'd begin to raise him slightly out of the mud, he'd lose his grip and he would fall back into the mud, going deeper into the mud each time. And after the 7th time of not being able to do it, Alfredo was getting dangerously close to being neck deep in the mud. And so the guy had to be pulled back out again. As soon as he was pulled back out again, more men volunteered themselves to go in there and try to yank him out, but many of them were not able to even get down to Alfredo. They would get stuck along the way. A couple did get to Alfredo, but they said his condition was worsening, he was weak, he wasn't even assisting trying to get pulled out. It was clear they were reaching the end. Finally, at 6:36 a.m. on Saturday, so 2.5 days after Alfredo fell in, they could not get him to respond on that two-way microphone. And so they sent down a sonar probe and they could not detect a heartbeat, and doctors declared him dead. The next day, liquid nitrogen was poured into the hole to preserve the body, and then 31 days later, they were finally able to extract it. After it was all over, the 25 million plus people that watched this take place live on television were crushed with what happened to Alfredo. There was a general sense that lots of people let this poor child down, which led to his death. But the person who was ultimately held accountable for it was the neighbor who had illegally dug the well. And so the neighbor was charged with manslaughter and was sent to jail, but their sentence is not publicly available online. So that's going to do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's episode, let us know in the comments what it is and where you found it. So give us the timestamp. And if you're the first to do that, we'll pin you at the top of the comments section. If you enjoyed today's video and you haven't done this already, please tell the like button you are sorry for all the hostility this year and that you want to take them on vacation as a way of making up for it. When they agree, take them to Skinwalker Ranch and promptly punt them through the portal. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 3, 4, even 5 video uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Twitter or on Instagram. My username for both platforms is the same. It's JohnBallin416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is Mr. Ballin. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called Mr. Ballin. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support, and until next time, that's going to do it. See ya.